This is An Infinite Path, spoken word essays by Niles Heckman, some of which go on to become our documentary short subject films, half of which release freely here through the podcast, all of which can be found through your support at nilesheckman.com. Democracy has been a bit of a lighthouse through the dark storms of much, but not all, of history. Go back to your great-great-great-grandparents' generation and look at how, unless they were royalty, they likely lived extremely difficult lives. One could write a 12-book series, each being over 1,000 pages in length, on the history of democracy around the world. But to keep this short, let's say through human history, it is way better of a good thing and more of a natural thing, yet somewhat of a rare thing, and we are unapologetically pro-democracy. Democracy could be defined as government by the people, a form of government in which the supreme power is lodged in the hands of the people collectively, or in which the people exercise the powers of legislation, such as was the government of Athens. We very much support Graham Hancock's idea that we are a species with amnesia that has totally forgotten who we are in terms of deep time, but within memorable history, let's say within the last few thousand years, which is a small blip on the radar of the vast sands of time, that democracy, most recently originating from ancient Greece, can be said to be a form of government in which the people have the authority to deliberate and decide legislation, known as direct democracy, or to choose government officials to do so, known as representative democracy. A republic is a state in which supreme power is held by the people and their elected representatives, and which has an elected or nominated president rather than a monarch. A democratic republic is a form of government operating on principles adopted from a republic and a democracy. As a cross between two exceedingly similar systems, democratic republics may function on principles shared by both republics and democracies. While not all democracies are republics, like constitutional monarchs, for example, and not all republics are democracies. Common definitions of the terms democracy and republic often feature overlapping concerns, suggesting that many democracies function as republics, and many republics operate on somewhat democratic principles. Cornerstones of democracy include freedom of religion, speech, assembly, association, property rights, inclusiveness and equality, citizenship, voting rights, freedoms from unwanted deprivation of the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Although democracy is generally understood to be defined by voting, consensus has adjusted over time in regards to the precise definition of democracy. Karl Popper says that the classical view of democracy is simply, in brief, the rule of the people, and that people have the right to rule. Although a human, person, and citizen are actually not the same thing, in ancient Greece, this revolutionary idea of all eligible citizens being allowed to speak and vote in the assembly, which sets the laws of the city-state, was novel and incredibly forward-thinking for the time. However, surprise, surprise, at the time, Athenian citizenship actually excluded women, slaves, and youths being below the age of military service. So effectively, 1 out of 4 residents at the time in Athens qualified as citizens who could vote. There will always be debate and disagreement amongst people how things should be done personally within our own lives, and also within the rules set forth by society known as laws, which, if one is in somewhat worst-case scenario, hires a lawyer as a representative to help them deal with those rules. And politicians are representatives to then deal with those same things in the aggregate, collectively within groups. The best way the outcomes of elections have been worked out since ancient Greek democracy, either direct or representative, is the majority goes, which means over 50%. It also means that yes, 49.999 etc% of those who voted may end up not being pleased with the outcome, because they are in the minority. But the point is, each person had their say. And we want that, regardless of the status of any citizen. As long as they are a member of the country, they should have their say, regardless of who they are and what they have done. Who is considered part of the people, or otherwise maybe more specifically, the citizenship, and how authority is shared amongst or delegated by people has changed over time and at different rates in different countries. But operations have evolved to more and more include all of a democratic country's inhabitants, without exclusion. That does not mean only by the few being the rich people or some sort of exclusive group of people. It means all the people of the country should have the option to have their say in who they elect to represent them. In the United States, anti-democracy folks still have prevented certain citizens from the voter rolls. Criminals would be one example. But even someone such as Albert Fish, who is often said to be one of the, if not the, most disgusting serial killers of all time, who literally raped, killed, and ate children, should be able to vote. These types of bottom-barrel citizens probably wouldn't help your campaign if they showed up to your clown Klan rally, though. Through much of recent recorded history, from ancient Greece transitioning to the early 21st century, attacks on our democratic institutions throughout the world and who can use their voice as their vote have at times improved, but also at times have intensified. And we are in one of these continuing times of intensification as we write this and also speak it. Having such occurrences undertaken both make one realize how the fight to uphold basic freedoms is sadly a constant one, and also that those things should never and can never be taken for granted, with an underlying assumption that they will always be there being a lazy one. Because unfortunately, authoritarian starvation has been more the default for our many previous generations during this processional cycle. So both the individual and the collective must always organize together and never put their feet up and just kick back like the dude from Lebowski, so to speak. Since this fight will never be finished, it's not perfect, but democracy is the best we have in our current time. It is both an experiment and an idea, and an unfinished one. Most of the freest countries in the world that successfully transitioned from authoritarian monarchs of the past dark ages, with years of blood spilled through revolutions to do so, still operate more like thievocracy, plutocracy, or kleptocracy in disguise today. While the last few authoritarian nightmare countries are still subtly hiding their disdain for the real thing, and even the fake watered-down Thievo, Pluto, or Klepto versions. So claiming to be pro-democracy oftentimes means the real thing, which has not been fully actualized, and likely never will be in our lifetimes, but is the best ideal for what it's capable of doing during our children's future lifetimes, but is thus worth aspiring toward and fighting for. A famous story of one of the founders of the United States goes, after the Constitutional Convention of 1787, when the country was still trying to very much figure out what it was and what it was going to be, Benjamin Franklin was walking out of Independence Hall when someone shouted out, "Doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" To which Franklin supposedly responded with a rejoinder that was at once witty and ominous, "A republic, if you can keep it." Although you are likely familiar with this quote, there's an extra line to the story that doesn't leave it on such a negative hanger, like many tellings of it do. The other person he was speaking to was likely Philadelphia's mayor at the time, Samuel Powell, responding again by saying, "And why not keep it?" We realize that politics is frankly exhausting. Even Canadians say that American politics is exhausting from Canada. And we, like you, would rather spend your time and effort outside of life's other responsibilities pursuing your own creative interests, rather than being down in the weeds of day-to-day polarized politics. Our body of work does not intend to focus exclusively on political infighting. Yet when basic foundations of democracy are constantly being challenged during our lifetimes, we know it's focusing some of our outputs on this aspect of society from what is hopefully a higher philosophical vantage point. For much of alternate sources of information findable outside of the old legacy media are still just politics in disguise, and we would rather touch on political philosophy upfront and honestly, yet certainly not exclusively. What is paramount to realize here is that small d democracy is a political enactment of a spiritual idea, a notion that each of us has intrinsic value, a reason for being here, and are a spark of the divine, each created in what the theologians call the imago Dei, otherwise known as the image of God. Because this is a spiritual puzzle for the species, we feel a bit obligated to touch on this as we may know a thing or two about spirituality from outside exclusively a religious menu. So expect a good chunk of upcoming essays to focus around deconstructing, unpacking, and explaining pro-democracy political philosophy from a unique perspective of the spiritual and its relationship to binary mechanics in the material realm. Detailing the reasons why we know, for example, a problem with religion has always been and continues to be that it's had so much political garbage dumped on top of it, resulting in occurrences where a large percentage of those who claim this is spiritual warfare are actually theocrats who are some of the biggest threats to democracy itself. These essays have come to revolve around a life philosophy we've developed called the individualization trinity, which orbits around individual growth, balance, and creativity. But if there's one thing that these writings are more overarchingly about than anything else, it's the individual's self-development. which can otherwise be known as the philosophy of the development of the self. As a society cannot have a healthy, lasting democracy without a knowledgeable, well-educated, and self-developed populace. So hopefully as this work continues, it does an ever so small part to help you, the reader or listener, continue your own self-development and pro-democratic feelings, thinkings, and actings that not only results in keeping democratic republics strong, but also helps move all of us move toward a more perfected, pro-democratic civilization.